Welcome back, dear viewers. You're still watching The Breakfast Show live on Nile TV International. It's now time for our main topic of discussion for today, and we're going to be talking, of course, about Africa. And Africa is, the African market is by all means one of the promising markets in the whole world. It is also an important part of the future of the Egyptian exports. And in fact, it's a huge and promising market with a population of more than 1,300,000,000 people. And Egypt has been keen on increasing its concentration of industrial and its bilateral trade with Africa. And to shed more light on this topic, we're most delighted to be joined here in the studio by Mrs. Shireen Ramadan, and she's the Assistant Secretary General of the Human Capital Afro Act. A very good morning, Mrs. Shireen, and thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning.
Good morning. First of all, if you can tell us more about the importance of the African market for the Egyptian exports.
Right, well, in order to talk about that, we're going to have a look at the Egyptian economy and the African economy, actually. So if you look at the Egyptian economy, Egypt historically has been known as, the hub or the center for commercial activities, especially for international companies that require to do business in the Middle East, especially because of the geographical location that comes as a crossroad between the East and West. So in order for Egypt to keep the position as the commercial hub or the center for commercial activities for many countries, especially with the presence of other commercial hubs in the Gulf, etc. Egypt has entered into like a full economic reform in the early 90s, and in this economic reform, the trade was at the forefront of the reform strategies. And some of these reforms was unilateral. Some of them was as part of Egypt's commitment to the GATT, the General Agreement for Tariff and Trade, or the World Organization, which obliged Egypt to actually decrease the tariffs on imported goods by 98%, actually, from the period between 1995 and 2005. And since Egypt has recorded a substantial increase in imported goods, there was a trade deficit, which reached actually up to I think 32.6 billion in 2015-16, the fiscal year 15-16, compared to 12 billion in 2005-2006. So anyways, all these things made it clear that Egypt need to add its exports to foreign countries, to regional areas, etc. Of course, the idea for adding exporting was mainly to be able to export to neighboring countries, to African countries, to Arab countries, and of course to the other foreign countries.
To open new markets.
To open new markets, to diversify risks, etc. And in order to do that, Egypt has entered an array of agreements and investment reforms and strategies to be able to cooperate with African countries, to be able to, like the Continental Free Trade Agreement, etc., to be able to open new markets, to be able to, as you said, like open new markets, diversify your risk, being able to have agreements to allow Egypt for more exporting possibilities.
Speaking about agreements, Mrs. Shireen, if you can tell us more about the African Free Trade Agreement.
Right. Well, the African Free Trade Agreement is actually it's an agreement that makes the 55 countries, member states of the African Union, come together in a free trade area. It actually is considered the second largest or the first largest free trade area since the World Trade Organization. It is a very important agreement that allows for free trade between African countries, moving goods and services and business people, for allowing more cooperation in terms of industrial cooperation, imports and exports. It aims at having a custom union in the very near future, or facilitates the acceleration of this So it actually allows for more investment and commercial activities and cooperation between the African countries.
In light of the COVID-19, Mrs. Shireen, that has brought the whole world to a standstill, how do you think it has affected this unprecedented global emergency, has affected the performance of economy and trade in the African continent?
Well, of course, the effect of the corona was a global effect on all countries. It affected, of course, the tourism, the airlines, everything, and affected the mobility of business people and, of course, of products when the routes, the airline routes or the marine routes was blocked. So it did affect the economy globally. Specifically in Africa, the Continental Free Trade Agreement was due to commence. It was due to commence trading under this agreement in July 2019, which Taman was postponed, of course, because of the COVID. Well, the expected date is supposed to be January 2021, but still, you never know. I mean, unless the pandemic is over, unless the vaccine has been tested and showed substantial numbers of cases being better, we never know what's going to happen next when it comes to COVID.
And speaking about the active vaccine, I think once there's progress been made, do you think that this will have a direct impact on the economy?
Indeed. I mean, if the vaccine works and if the pandemic is, I mean, because mostly this pandemic is causing panic and is causing
lockdowns.
Lockdowns, well, yeah, lockdowns and panic, and even those who are not locked down, the restrictions and restrictions on movement, on traveling, on testing and all this, it's causing a lot of unease and it's not facilitating the trade activities and the commercial activities and moving of services, goods, business people, etc. So if the vaccine proves actually to be efficient and it stops all this panic, of course it's going to reflect on the African economy, on the global economy, to be honest.
Also, Mrs. Shireen, there has been several conferences that has been held in Egypt and in the continent, and Egypt has been playing a pivotal role in these conferences. How do you think that they can have a ramification, a positive ramification on the Egyptian economy?
Well, these conferences, as we said, Egypt has been putting the idea of export as the top priority of its policy or financial economic reform in general. And part of the efforts and the activities to be able to facilitate this aim is to open a channel of communication and cooperation between yourself and foreign countries, African countries, Arab countries, etc. And specifically during our chairmanship of the European Union,
African Union.
The African Union, we had to utilize this time in order to be able to open channels of cooperation, agreements, common strategies towards the sustainable development of Africa in general, the economic boost, boosting trade, boosting exports, etc.
Mrs. Shireen, also speaking about projects and the sustainable development of Africa, Egypt has been executing a number of mega projects in different African countries. So how can this, or how do you see the role of Egypt in the process of the development of the Black continent?
Right. Well, as part of the Agenda 2063 and when we assumed the chairmanship of the African Union, all these were part of the main goal, which is the sustainable development of the whole continent, through the sustainable development of each country on its own, each African country on its own. So part of Egypt's vision is to have mega projects inside Egypt, which we all witnessed, like the Suez Canal, like all the mega projects, the new administrative city, etc. So this is part of the sustainable development of Egypt internally, and part of the sustainable development of the whole continent is to cooperate all together into having contributing to the infrastructure of the whole continent, having mega projects in other African countries. actually some private sector companies have been actively working, Egyptian private sector companies have been actively working in Africa, having mega projects like a lot of very well-known companies in Egypt. And that actually contributes to the efforts of Egypt to actually bridge the gap between, because you know how Africa is the second largest continent in terms of population and area. And as we know, it's all rich in natural resources, rich in human resources. And for long decades, Africa was perceived as the place that is to be exploited. You exploit the natural resources, you take exploit the natural resources for outside the continent. But now it's different. Now there has been a lot of eyes on Africa, because there have been a lot of reforms, a lot of infrastructural activities. In fact, the World Bank has announced in 2018, I think, has announced that it's going to invest over 45 billion in Africa throughout the 3 years after 2018. Invest in infrastructure projects, educational projects, sanitation, water, agriculture, etc., etc. So now Africa is regaining its place as an economic, in the economic map of the world. It's not anymore the continent that's going to be exploited. No, you have all the opportunities, investment opportunities inside the continent, especially when you have more than 1,300,000,000 consumers, mostly youth. You have a growing middle class. So it's like a vast place for opportunities for investment. All from, I mean, the eyes of the whole world is on Africa. And since we are part of Africa, we might as well utilize this for the better of the economy of Egypt.
Yes. Mrs. Shireen, speaking about marketing of the Egyptian products in African markets, do we face any obstacles in this regard? And if yes, how can we overcome them?
Right. Well, in fact, there was a lot of obstacles that was faced by any international company wanting to invest in Africa. You have the political instability, for example. You have the logistical barriers. You have the banking. I mean, now we started to overcome. You have the banking barriers, like the banking activities, being able to move goods when you don't have branches for your banks in some countries in Africa makes it not easy to be able to facilitate the procedures. As I said, logistical barriers, which doesn't facilitate the movement of goods, and also you have the tariffs and the cost of importing goods. And one more thing is the routes, like the airline routes, the marine routes, not being able to reach some countries in Africa makes it, these were some barriers towards investing, especially in trade in Africa.
Yes. Speaking about maritime, Mrs. Shireen, how would the launch of a maritime connection or line between Egypt and Africa boost the trade and economic cooperation?
Right. Well, of course, as we mentioned earlier, we have some obstacles facing the investment in Africa and the trade in Africa, and one of them is not having proper routes for goods and services, for business people to be able to commute all over Africa. For some remote countries, not having the routes to reach these countries makes it, or kind of discourages a lot of companies, a lot of investment people, a lot of private sector companies, a lot of countries to actually go and invest in these areas. So having a maritime route that can actually facilitate you reaching most of the African countries will not only facilitate the procedures, etc. It's also going to be, I believe, cost effective when it comes to moving massive goods. If you're trading or exporting like massive goods, rather than using airlines or etc. You would use marine, which is going to be more efficient, cost effective for this purpose.
Yeah. What about opening Egyptian banks in other African countries. Would that help?
Of course, that's another part of facing the banking procedural barriers that we were facing when it comes to exporting to Africa, because as I mentioned, a lot of private companies, which is a major plays a major role in boosting the export of Egypt to foreign countries, were totally discouraged to be able to deal or to export to African countries because of the banking restrictions and not having the banks not being able to communicate with each other, not having branches of Egyptian banks in Africa. So now when you start having branches for Egyptian banks in Africa, like for example Bank Misr and the Commercial International Bank, they've all been discussing opening branches in various African countries, and this will definitely facilitate the procedural part, the financial part of exporting to African countries.
Mrs. Shireen, also, how do you see the chances of Egyptian companies when it comes to investing in Africa?
Well, there's a vast opportunities for any country that is that requires to export or invest in general in Africa, because first of all, you have a lot of investment opportunities. You have infrastructural projects that require to be done. You have educational projects, agriculture. You have Africa is one of the richest, apart from the natural resources and minerals, etc. It's got the vastest agricultural land in the world, but definitely it's not all utilized. So again, you have a lot of investment opportunities, and as I said, the eyes of the whole world is on Africa now, because it's time to invest in Africa, having investment projects inside Africa, rather than taking the resources to be utilized outside. And with the technological advances, with the economic reforms, the social reforms, with the vision of the Agenda 2063 focusing on the sustainable, overall, inclusive development of Africa, it has been reflecting on the human resources or the human capital, the African human capital. You have more skilled labor, more skilled, educated youth, and as we know that most of the population in Africa is youth. So that also facilitates or opens the way or paves the way for having the investments for Africa, because you have the partners, you have the stakeholders and the African partners that can partner with you to facilitate the investment for the economic growth for Africa, and of course the gain of those who are going to come and invest in Africa.
How do you see, Mrs. Shireen, the role of the trade representation offices in enhancing the trade exchange between Egypt and other African countries?
Of course, it's very important. It's a very important role because, as you know, trade offices or trade representation for any country kind of promotes the requirements of the country when it comes to trade. It negotiates on behalf of the country. It boosts. It also helps in marketing the ideas, the trade ideas of a country. Facing problems. It works as the embassy for trade, the country's embassy, but when it comes to trade. So having more trade offices or trade representatives in various African countries will help, they kind of cover or it's like the insurance for those private companies wanting to go and invest in a country. When you have trade representation, that encourages them more. They have give them assurance that their interests are covered and their interests are taken care of when it comes to investing in this country. So having more trade representation in African countries will definitely boost investment in exporting.
How do you also evaluate the size of trade between Egypt and Africa, and what are your expectations for the future?
Well, let's say in the past decades, it was not really, it was very minimal, the percentage of exporting to Africa. But in the past years, especially in the past year when we assumed the chairmanship of the African Union, we have been focusing on the idea of actually investment and commercial cooperation and industrial cooperation all together between Egypt and African countries, with the trade at the forefront of all agreements we have been making when it comes to commercial activities. So it has been rising, the exports to Africa has been rising, but still it hasn't reached anywhere where we want it to reach. As per the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, for example, the United Nations Commission for a Financial Commission for Africa, they have said that if the agreement was to commence, it can add the commercial activities and the intra-African trade by 52%, only by removing and minimizing the cost of import goods.
That's a huge increase.
That's a huge increase, and it said it could be doubled if the restrictions on tariff barriers were also faced. So that's a substantial percentage that tells you where we could be going when it comes to trade with Africa.
Mrs. Shireen, also, can you shed the light on the strategy for developing Egyptian exports to the African continent?
Well, it comes again as a part of the Vision 2063, 2030, the sustainable development. You know how the Agenda 2063 has so many fragments, and part of this fragment is the economic sustainable development, which puts trade, as we said, at the forefront of the economic reform. And given the Egyptian history, as I told you, the Egyptian economic history, where of course, due to the population, the rise in population, etc., we are having a lot of imported goods, and we are having a deficit, a trade deficit, that has risen from, as I mentioned earlier, from over 35.6 billion in 2016, 2015, compared to 12 billion in 2006, 2005, which is a huge burden on the Egyptian economy. So, as I mentioned, trade would be at the forefront of the strategies for economic reform. Exporting will be the top priority of the strategies to be able to face the trade deficit, etc.
Yeah. Investment opportunities, Mrs. Shireen, in Africa, is it the appropriate time to do so? Or do you think that there's, despite the COVID-19, that there's some uncertainties and this would minimize the investment in the continent?
Well, it's perfectly the right time. Now, apart from the force majeures and the exceptions of a pandemic or, things that come and go, right before the corona, all the studies, all the United Nations reports, the World Bank's reports were mentioning how Africa is the future for investment, the future for commercial activities. The investment by China in Africa, by the West, the East, everybody had eyes on Africa to start investing in Africa because of all the reasons I mentioned earlier. So it's definitely the right time to start taking a part, to start diversifying your market, diversifying your risks, and taking a part in the competition that's going to be starting in Africa before it's too late.
Yeah. How do you evaluate the efforts that are being exerted by the Ministry of Investment and International Cooperation in building on what has been already achieved by Egypt during its chairmanship for the African Union?
Well, as I said, it's top priority for the Minister of Foreign Trade and Industry. I've mentioned that it's top priority for them to be able to boost the economy through trade, through rising exports. What the efforts that has been done is entering into a vast array of agreements with African countries and with Arab countries to be able to boost these ideas, holding forums and conferences to be able to have cooperation and to be able to bridge the gap in ideas and strategies for trade and for economy between African countries, and this was the main focus for the strategies for economic reforms and for trade and commercial activities in general when it comes to 2019, 2020.
Yeah. Can I just go back to the intra-African trade agreement? It's a very important one, and unfortunately, due to the COVID, we haven't exploited this agreement. What are your expectations for 2021 as soon as it commences?
Right. Well, I mean, if it commences in time, in January 2021, as we have been promised, it will definitely have a huge impact on the whole strategies of trade and the economic development of the continent in general. And also, as I mentioned earlier, how the World Bank has estimated the rise in trade.
52%.
52.6%, the intra-African trade only. And it's a substantial percentage. And that only if you minimize the cost of importing. And it could be doubled again if the tariff barriers were minimized. So these are huge numbers. I mean, so it's definitely going to boost the economy of the whole continent, and it's going to have a huge impact on that.
Mrs. Shireen, as we're wrapping up, I'd like to listen to your closing remarks.
Well, as I say, and as I always say, Africa is one of the richest continents in the world. And it's always been one of the richest continents in the world, with rich in mineral resources, in natural resources, in agricultural land, in human resources, actually. But the main issue was utilizing all this, utilizing Africa by Africans. And if this was reached, I think that will make a huge change in the whole world, to be honest.
Mrs. Shireen Ramadan, Assistant Secretary General, Human Capital, Afro-Act, thank you so much for your insight, and thank you so much for being with us on The Breakfast Show.
You're most welcome.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.
And dear viewers, now we move on to a quick break, and then we'll be back to resume The Breakfast Show live on Nile TV International.